in this year of significant contraction. What are the consequences? What are the immediate consequences? Bearing in mind that the newspaper press is still 90% dependent on traditional sources of advertising. Only 10% of its revenues overall are coming from online advertising. Online advertising is still growing. It's growing at a weaker pace than it was, and it still constitutes only a very modest percentage of overall advertising revenue that is earned. So what are some of the consequences? From an editorial point of view, I would say the most worrying consequences are a reduction in editorial strength, the layoffs of large numbers of journalists across the country. There's a dramatic reduction in the numbers of investigative journalists. There is a dramatic reduction in the number of foreign bureaus and of foreign correspondents. And there is also a continuing narrowing of the news agenda to a smaller number of topics that are intensely reported, but to the exclusion of many other possible topics. Now, the argument in my paper is that, sad and significant and worrying though this crisis is, our explanations for that crisis are somewhat narrowly conceived. There are many other problems going on in addition to the internet. It's not just about the internet, so that's how I bring the paper back to this issue of technology and technology change. I think we sometimes give way too much importance to the technology and fail to see the technology in its broader social, cultural, and political context. We have seen for a long time in the United States, but particularly acutely, in my view, over the last 8 years, some catastrophic failures of the Anglo-American model of journalism. We have wonderful journalists and we have wonderful journalism, but too often, on some of the most significant issues of the day, the most profound, the most important, the most widely relevant issues of the day, the press, I regret to say, has failed us. There are many instances that I would offer to argue this case, and each one of those issues would require a separate discussion, a separate symposium, so there's just absolutely no way that I'm going to be able to deal with them in the short space that I have. But perhaps the best known issue, one that we can all recognize in this room, is the 2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq, on the pretext that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, a belief that is widely discredited. I maintain, although I can only offer this as a hypothesis, sadly a hypothesis that has yet to be investigated, that during the years of the Bush administration, a very significant proportion of the US population had no effective voice in the mainstream media, a failure of voice. In other words, a failure of reportage that recognized the news interests and needs and demands of a very significant proportion of the entire population that is dependent on the mainstream. The crisis was narrowly conceived also in terms of who it affects. We've talked about it primarily in terms of the newspaper industry, but it affects the whole news business. In network television, we have seen for a long time a constantly declining number of viewers for network television news in the major evening broadcasts. We've seen an increasingly aged population that is viewing these newscasts. Local television is faring better than network television, but it too is showing signs now of stumbling and of retrenching on its editorial costs. Cable television, we have entered a period, I believe, of stabilization, the end of growth, in other words, the end of growth for audiences and for revenues. We have addressed the issue of the crisis of the newspaper industry mainly so far in terms of the market. I have one more minute. Mainly in terms of a market, an implosion of a traditional market. And I want to argue, yes, that's important, and we have to invent new business models. But I also am trying to argue that there's also a failure here, there's a real problem here in our models of journalism. and in our excessive commitment to the Anglo-American model of journalism, which is very fact-driven, is very information-oriented, is very context-free in terms of history and in terms of other forms of context, is typically disconnected as a series of pieces of information that are disconnected one from the other. And my plea is to my colleagues, but also, of course, to a much broader audience, that we need to revisit other, not only to think of new forms of journalism, but also to revisit some previous ones. And one starting point there is Mancini's comparative study of press models, particularly comparing European press models with those of North America over the past 150 to 200 years. The Anglo-American model is a model that was developed primarily for market reasons. It was developed so that city newspapers could appeal to very, very broad audiences, appeal to advertisers as being the most important vehicles for reaching out to very large numbers of readers. Unfortunately, that has a very centralizing effect on editorial content. And that centralizing effect seems arguably to be marginalizing more and more people who fall outside of that safe sector. And I think I will leave it at that. Thank you.
شكرا للدكتور أوليفر على هذه المعلومات القيمة وعلى الالتزام بالوقت. الباحثة الثانية هي الدكتورة هالة نوفل، وعنوان بحثها انعكاسات ثورة التكنولوجيا الحديثة على الأداء الاتصالي للمراسل الدولي في وكالات الأنباء ودوره في التغيير الاجتماعي.